Government, for those of you who haven't been here before. My name is Daniel Thornton. I'm the Programme Director here at the Institute for Government. I'll shortly be introducing Liz Truss, who I'm sure you're all here to hear. But first of all, a few housekeeping notes. We don't have a fire alarm planned today, so if you hear an alarm, please leave by the main staircase out here where you came in and assemble by the statue of George VI. Make sure it's George VI. Please feel free to tweet. We are using the hashtag at Truss and at IFG events. Thirdly, for those of you who haven't been here before, the Institute for Government is a charity which since 2008 has been working to help make government more effective. The director of the Institute, Peter Riddell, is here on the stage with me, and we'll have a discussion with the Secretary of State before we open to the audience. Liz Truss will be known to many of you, but I will briefly introduce her. She worked for Shell and Cable and Wireless and qualified as an accountant, and then worked at a think tank before becoming an MP for South West Norfolk in 2010. She became Parliamentary Under-Secretary at the Department for Education in 2012, and in a meteoric rise in 2014 became Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. In this role, she's championed British food, she's grappled with flooding, and today she's going to be talking about how she is modernising the department. Please join me in welcoming Liz Truss.
Well, thank you very much. It's hard to believe that the Institute for Government has only been around for 8 years. In that time, there's scarcely a corner of Whitehall that it hasn't shone a light into. It's a rare combination of a think tank, a classroom, and a critical friend. And I don't think I would be standing here today if I agreed with the blogger Guido Fawkes, who described the Institute as the most serious threat to freedom in Britain since the Communist Party. And we do know that the works of Marx and Mao are enjoying a bit of a revival at the moment in certain parts of SW1. I'm not convinced that they have reached Carlton Gardens yet, although you never know, Peter may have a copy of the little red book in his home. But it's an exciting time, I think, for us to be talking about reform in government. And I'm somebody who's always cared about this issue, but I am a proselytiser, and I think that more of us should care. It matters far beyond the world of Whitehall watching, because it's critical to our mission to build Britain's economy and society in this turnaround decade. I believe that the why and the what are inevitably linked to the how. If we want Britain to lead the world, our governance needs to lead the world too. It needs to enable talent and enterprise, to do less, and where it acts, to be more productive and more open to ideas. As the introduction said, I worked at Shell and Cable and Wireless in the 1990s and 2000s, and I saw the changes that technology wrought, from the carefully drafted memo right through to the slapdash BlackBerry message. And the arrival of the internet didn't just mean automating what we already did. It meant companies making huge efficiency savings and the whole culture of organisations changing. Layers of management were stripped out, and we had to be more nimble and more responsive. We face ever fiercer global competition and shifting patterns of climate, trade, and economic power. And to meet those challenges, our productivity must match and exceed the levels of the best performing nations. The government's supply-side reform, to taxes, to welfare and education, are all vital to closing that gap. We're also getting out of the way and allowing enterprise to thrive. Since 2010, 5 private sector jobs have been created for every job lost in the public sector. And we must improve our own productivity and make sure that our actions drive competitiveness. This means breaking up monopolies, opening up competition for the supply of public goods, and minimising the burdens of regulation. Making government work better is something we've been grappling with for generations. The Northcote Trevelyan reforms of the 1850s were about meritocracy and efficiency in Whitehall. Government departments coordinated by the Cabinet Office were the product of the First World War and David Lloyd George with the Hankey and Haldane reforms which he started. The post-war growth of government led to massive delivery departments. The Fulton Committee of 1968 called for much greater separation of services and policy, the how and the why, and for openness to outside experts. This led to the creation of the Next Steps agencies, starting in the 1980s. We saw real improvements as a result of this, but the creation of so many arm's-length bodies also brought duplication, friction, and extra costs. And since 2010, we've been reshaping this landscape by sharing more expertise across government, like the Government Digital Service. And in the case of Defra, we've seen the number of organisations reduce from more than 90 in 2010 to today's 34. I want Defra to be leading the way in the next phase of change. And I believe the 4 key principles are about government being more integrated, more open, more modern, and more local. The technology revolution means that people today expect responsiveness and seamlessness. They want services shaped around their needs, not around organisational convenience. The days of traditional government departments saying, take it or leave it, are over. Defra touches the lives of every individual and every business in the country. And our starting point has to be the people who deal with us and the landscapes that we are trying to enhance, not our organogram. We will structure our work around river catchments and landscapes that make up the environment. For the first time, we will have a plan and a budget for each area, rather than 34 organisations operating with different plans. We're going to be integrating these plans with the 25-year framework we're creating for the environment, which we're going to be launching this spring. And when community groups, NGOs, farmers and businesses talk to us, they won't be passed from pillar to post. The important legal independence and regulatory role of Natural England and the Environment Agency will be maintained, whilst more flexible operations will mean the same spending, delivering results several times over. We will share the same IT, HR and communications, releasing resources for the front line. A new environment analysis unit will pull together data, stats and economics from across our organisation, meaning that flood alleviation, flora and fauna, farming, water, soil and air will be considered together, not as isolated issues. And the idea of integration goes beyond the Defra border. The same principle applies across government and into the business and voluntary world. So we're turbocharging our food exports and inward investment by establishing the Great British Food Unit, where companies from Hale and Mon Sea Salt and Weetabix will have a platform for their products. By bringing together elements of UKTI, Defra, and the Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board, which is funded by farmers, we've created a UK and international network with 40 staff in London, 5 in China, and other locations around Britain and the world. Free and open debate is one of our great advantages as a nation. I'm not sure that government and policy wonks ever had a monopoly on good ideas, but we certainly don't now, and modern technology makes it easier than ever for us to access the most creative minds. Matt Hancock is leading the changes to the civil service, like requiring all senior appointments to be advertised outside Whitehall. This draws on previous experience. As Lord Wilson, the former Cabinet Secretary, has said, nearly 30% of permanent secretaries appointed between 1900 and 1919 had begun life in another profession. Their average age was under 40. It was not unknown for former MPs and junior ministers to become permanent secretary. Now there's a threat. The emo is a much discussed idea. Some might think it's a goth punk movement, but it isn't, as I'm sure everybody in this room knows. It's an innovation introduced by Francis Maud. And I'm a huge fan of the emo because I think it complements the superb expertise we already have in Defra and helps us do more and reach more people. We have Ellen Broad from the Open Data Institute driving forward reform with our head of data, Alex Coley. We've got Fiona Gately, who's worked for Duchy Originals and school food campaigns in Britain and America. She's promoting British food and drink with our food director, Sarah Church. We've got the economist, Adam Menon, and government reform specialist, Kanishka Narayan, bringing new ideas to the department. And we've got other outside experts, including Ian Hall, a financial services specialist. I am pushing Defra to welcome good ideas wherever they come from, creating a flourishing greenhouse of creativity. This means consulting as widely as possible and showing our workings in public. For the environment framework, for example, we're going to be launching the framework in spring with the final results through at the end of this year. And we're using a platform called Dialogue to enable contributors to have their say. I think we have a huge resource to tap. The British people have unparalleled love and pride for nature and landscapes. Millions join groups like the RSPB and the National Trust, and farmers and volunteers are working to improve the countryside, like the ones I met last month who brought the harvest mouse back to Selborne in Hampshire. But there are too many people in our country who are not aware of these natural wonders, how food is produced, or benefiting from the experience of climbing catbells in the Lake District or visiting the National Arboretum in Gloucestershire. And as well as opening our policy making to new ideas, I want to open our environment to new people. This means national parks, Kew, the Forestry Commission, attracting more visitors, especially children from all backgrounds and from all parts of the country. It means making training, volunteering and apprenticeships in countryside management, farming and the environment more widely available. These are huge public assets, and we should ensure they are benefiting the public as a whole as widely as possible. Now, I'm pleased to say that Defra is at the forefront of the open data revolution. By June, we will be on target to release 8,000 data sets, as I promised last summer. I think it's an immense achievement of our department that 1/3 of all of the government's open data will be Defra's. Now, I can tell you we don't have 1/3 of all of the government's budget, but we've got 1/3 of all of the data out there. This is a major resource that entrepreneurs already use to design new tools, from websites for people to check their local river levels to software for the latest precision farming techniques. Our data is driving exciting advances in mapping. Architects are using our LiDAR data, a 3D map of the country, built up with airborne laser readings, to build a model of London as they plan the next skyscraper. Game developers are using it to build new landscapes for Minecraft, and archaeologists are discovering lost networks of Roman roads from Lancashire to Dorset. As a department, we're increasing our capital investment by 12% over the course of this Parliament. And that means that as well as increasing our spending on flood defences, we're also increasing our investment in IT, science and facilities by 30%. This new technology will help us to assess risk more precisely, I do apologise, and to automate more monitoring and inspection, enabling us to reduce our running costs by 15%. And that means we can do things like introduce a single helpline for farmers, and streamline the way people apply for environmental permits and track animal movements. Our single farm inspection task force, which we promised in our manifesto, will cut tens of thousands of official visits without sacrificing standards. This all reduces the time and money people will have to spend dealing with us, so that by 2020, we will have swept away £470 million worth of unnecessary costs for business. The world is more educated than it ever has been before. People have better information for making decisions at the touch of a screen. Government should move beyond making decisions on people's behalf to ensuring that they have the information, the tools, and the structures to act. At this most basic level, this means individuals being given greater information, tools, and capability to contribute to their local environment. For example, providing habitats for bees in their gardens. It also means communities having the wherewithal to make local decisions. In the Slow the Flow project in Pickering, the community are using the landscape to provide flood protection and environmental benefits. I think it's important to note, though, that empowering individuals and communities requires Defra staff on the ground to be able to take genuine decisions and resolve issues rather than passing them up the line. And during the flooding in the north of England, Environment Agency staff were communicating directly with communities, online and on broadcast, at a level never seen before. I want to see more people in our organisation having that ownership and fulfilment, and to be able to get things done locally. The tools being designed by the Environment Analysis Unit and the Natural Capital Committee, under the leadership of Dieter Helm, will give a consistent framework for people to take decisions nationally and locally. For example, natural capital accounting will help calculate where woodland planting would provide the greatest benefits for plants and animals, recreation, and reduce flood risk, alongside the economic gains for forestry and farming. We will be starting 3 Pathfinder projects later this year, one on the coast, one in an urban setting, and one in a large rural landscape. The governance reforms through the 25-year plan for the environment will also make it easier for us to bring in talents and finances from other organisations. People could use environmental impact bonds, for example, to raise money to plant trees based on the value they provide for the future. In the 1980s, Conservative governments took on and broke up entrenched monopolies in public utilities and the City of London, releasing the pent-up energy of the economy. Today, a Conservative government is doing the same for how we are governed. We are harnessing new ideas and technology with an open approach to policy and decision-making. We're devolving power and responsibility to both people inside and outside government who can bring the best solutions. And just as our economy was turned around in the 1980s, in this turnaround decade, we are creating a state that is more responsive to people and place and the realities of a more integrated and open world. Together, we can create the smarter, leaner state that will deliver the results for Britain. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we open up for questions, hand over to Peter Riddell.
Thank you very much indeed, Daniel. Thank you for that fascinating speech. I always think the reference to the IFG being the most serious threat to freedom since the Communist Party, I've never been quite sure how to take that. Is that a criticism or is it a compliment? Particularly given the ineffectiveness of the Communist Party, I'm inclined to view it rather critically, despite the activities of the Shadow Chancellor. We don't have many little red books here. We have many larger books, which everyone should read, like Whitehall Monitor, which tracks what's happening in Whitehall and isn't a little red book. It's full of rather more useful adages, and perhaps they might be more useful to the Shadow Chancellor. If I might begin, looking back on how you, so to speak, spent your Christmas, in Barbara and Welleys in Yorkshire, What conclusions did you draw for the organisation from the flood experience?
I think in terms of the response that there was to the flooding, clearly it was a very serious situation. We saw the wettest December ever and some very, very high levels of river and rainfall in Cumbria as well as in Lancashire and Yorkshire. I think we learned the lessons from previous floods in terms of making sure we had a coordinated response as soon as possible. So we had the army out from day one supporting the local communities. And also we've now got more integrated software that is being used on the ground by the emergency responders called Resilience Direct. So they were able to communicate in real time with each other, which was very important in terms of providing those solutions. So I think the speed of action is what I'd highlight as learning from those. Clearly, we are seeing more of these severe weather events, and one of the things we've launched is a review looking at how do we respond in the longer term. So what do we need to do to build our country's resilience? What do we need to do to make sure that our predictions of the future are better?
Now looking at, I mean, in a couple of ways you referred to in your speech, which is very interesting, you use the word integration a lot. You've got two enormous arm's length bodies working with your department. To what extent does it any longer make sense to have kind of independent arm's length bodies? Because you talked in the speech about a lot of sharing of IT, HR, a lot of background functions. Because in some departments, for example, the Home Office has brought a lot of the borders and immigration stuff back within the department. I mean, how long does that make any sense to have them as independent when you do face these crises which require a lot of integrated response?
I think there's a very important independent role for both the Environment Agency and Natural England, which is environmental protection and making sure that those decisions are made independent of politicians, so things like environmental analysis, but also in terms of flood defence spending, the government decides on what the formula should be, but the way it's applied is applied independently. So, for example, I don't think people would want politicians interfering in flood forecasting and the details of how that's done, or areas like the operation of the Foss Barrier in York and what is the best operational decision. So I think there are areas where I would like to see more collaboration, and that's what we're doing across Defra. And I think that's also true right across government. And I think modern technology provides a much better platform for integration than it ever has before. But there are some roles which, in my view, ought to remain independent, and they're essentially regulatory functions. And that was a very clear distinction Francis Maude made when he was doing the review in the last Parliament of arm's length bodies.
But even in the environment of very tight public spending controls, particularly on current resource spending, you could still maintain them as independent in the way the Environment Agency is now.
Absolutely, because I think we can have the benefits of independence, of having an independent voice on those issues about the environment, in the same way as the OBR looks at financial forecasts in an independent way, and I think that's a highly valued part of our political landscape. But that doesn't mean that the operations have to be entirely separate and that we can't share functions. So I'd use another example, which I did in my speech, of GDS working as a IT provider across government and providing shared platforms. I think you can have both. And I think what's happened historically is government has sort of shifted from one to the other. So there's been a fashion for arm's length, and then there's been a fashion for in-house. And you know, before I was in government, I worked in the corporate sector, and the same thing happens. There's a fashion for having lots of devolution, and then there's a fashion for having things in head office. And the answer is you've got to get the best of both worlds.
Another aspect of it, which you referred to in your speech, was, of course, in a lot of cases, the initial problem is a local authority one. Yet a lot of environmental problems are neatly in local authority areas. As you say, you're building your structure around river catchments and landscapes because that's where the problems occur. How are you going to work that properly when you've got a series of local authorities? These are the people jumping up and down in late December, January. how do you link that? You've got the environment agency, you've got you, and you've got local authorities.
So my approach has been to say, let's start with the governance structure of Defra and make sure that we have a clear plan across what the whole of our organisation does. Now, some of it fits with local authority boundaries, others don't. You have to find solutions on the border, essentially. That is possible. There's all kinds of government bodies with different local alignments. But I think getting it clear that there is one plan for Defra helps other organisations work with us, including local authorities.
You mentioned the government digital service. Well, Defra's had its problems in that area. Rural Payments Agency, which has gone through problem after problem over the time. The NAO, even as recently as December, was being fairly critical. How do you get that right? You talked about bringing data together, but ultimately the test is, are people going to feel that you're operating efficiently and well?
Yes, and I would point to the successes we've had as well. So if you look at the recent flooding, there was very good data available to local communities about the river levels, flood warnings, a lot of information access through the Environment Agency website. So we've also got some very good experience of data management as well. And I would highlight on farm payments, we've now got 70% of them out of the door as of last week. Of course, there are issues with government IT, and I think part of it is making sure that we have the skills in government to deal with that. I see it as mission critical for Defra, having good data and digital skills. I think it's the way that we are going to be able to manage our very, very diverse portfolio in an effective way. So it's about building up that skill base and learning from what's happened in the past.
Do you have to build it up yourself, or how much does it have to be drawn centrally from the centre in government?
Well, one of the critical things for Defra is maps. So a lot of our both problems and solution relates to maps because the environment is inherently very local. So, for example, to reduce our disallowance bill from the EU, we need to make sure our mapping is more accurate. Now, that's something I think we could share with other government departments. At the moment, the task is to make sure that Defra itself is all using the same map.
Now, coming back to, also you talked about changes within the department of opening up and so on. Is the concept of the traditional government department, I mean, there are now departmental boards, you will chair a board which has non-executive directors on it. How does that change, how has that changed in concept? I mean, from the traditional model, given what you've been describing as what Defra should be doing, in relation to your permanent secretaries here today, how have those relationships changed?
I think that I do think we need to see a change from the traditional Whitehall department. I think Whitehall has many strengths and great depth of expertise. I think that the changes in the world at large, and I referred to how corporations have changed, delayering, becoming more flexible. I think we're seeing that in Whitehall. We probably need to see more of it. And I think that being more open to outside influences and being prepared to take calculated risks is important. And I think that's happening at Defra. And bringing in the arm's length body into our decision-making process helps with that, because that provides an alternative view. In terms of Defra's arm's length body, it provides a view from what's happening on the ground, and I think that's a very important part of the process. I think sometimes in the past, I think the how has been divorced from the what, and I don't think those two are very easy to disentangle, and I like to see them considered together.
What value does having non-executive directors bring?
I think it's hugely valuable. I mean, I am up for as much debate and challenge as possible, because the instinct in government can sometimes be to not do things, and I think bringing that challenge is really important, and having non-executive directors who are prepared to talk about the way things have been done elsewhere is really helpful, and to bring that challenge to the organisation is really good.
Now, also, you highlighted in your speech and gave examples of the extended ministerial office, who you've brought in.
Yes.
And that's, and you know, there are about 2 or 3 departments which are leading on that. And it's only really got going since the election, because it was rather difficult to do late in the Parliament. In the debate about that, one of the concerns was a kind of one from Europe, that, you know, you see that when you interact with Europe, that the commissioners have their cabinets, and the danger is sometimes that can isolate the top of the organisation from the further down the organisation. And that the worry is the Director Generals in the European case are isolated from the commissioners and so on. Would there be a risk of that having your extended ministerial office might isolate you from the Directors General and directors running bits of policy?
I can see some of the DGs in the audience. I don't think they feel isolated from me.
Well, I'm glad to bring you all together.
Quite the opposite, but I think it adds to the organisation. I think it provides fresh impetus, and also what I find about Defra, which is a department with lots of different parts to it, is that there are a lot of embedded ideas that people have that haven't necessarily reached the surface. And I see that the extended ministerial office is a bit like bicarbonate of soda, sort of fizzing it up and bubbling it up and helping bring these ideas forward. But I've had really positive, I mean, maybe people are just saying this to me, but I have had really positive feedback from senior officials about the extended ministerial office, helping spread that different culture and helping become a department that discusses and debates ideas, because I think that's very important. I mean, I'm a great believer in politics generally. Ideas are what move things forward, and to have that within departments, I think, is really important.
How will that work with your special advisors, who are very much appointed by you with a political remit? Because that's something, you know, is being defined and explored now with, you know, examples of what you're doing and what's happening in a couple of other departments.
Well, I've talked about the specific people in the emo, partly to try and demystify the concept for the outside world, but they are people with specialisms. So, for example, we've got Fiona Gately, who's run food campaigns and is working with us on Great British Food, the Year of Great British Food, and bringing that outside expertise. Whereas a special advisor, so I've got 2 special advisors, one media and one policy special advisors, they work on the political side. So of course, people in the organisation talk to each other, but I think people are clear about the difference between a role that's political and one that is a specialist in a subject area or a particular type of analysis or driving a particular programme of reform. But the point about the extended ministerial office is they are the leading civil servants in the department, the permanent secretaries, the directors general, are responsible for, you know, leading the Defra programme. The extended ministerial office feed into that, rather than they're not an alternative source of doing things.
Another, I mean, you're operating, as you said in your speech, in a different spending context. You also are currently producing your single departmental plan. How is that different from the experience you had but when you were minister in the last Parliament?
I think probably because I was appointed to Defra 9 months before the election. We were in the final closing stages, so it's a very different discussion we're having now about what happens over the next 5 years. Everything's in that context. We're shortly, and what I want to do is make sure the single departmental plan is integrated with our 25-year plan for the environment, our 25-year food and farming plan, and of course our budget. So our budget needs to be led by the activities we're doing rather than the structures we've got. So, you know, when I talk about the local areas and making sure that we have a clear view across the local areas, that's the vision for the budget.
And how much, when we see them, it'll be, well, now in February, it'll be next month, we see them, how different will it be from the business plans which emerged, you know, which were set up under, at the beginning of the last Parliament?
Well, I can't really comment on, I've not seen anyone else's, I've not seen anyone else's business plans, and I haven't studied in detail the start of last Parliament's
Sure.
Defra plans. What is different about what we're doing is for the first ever time, we're looking at all of our organisations together. So we've just released a strategy document internally, which talks about all of Defra Group. And we're having a big room event to talk about our budget with all of the different people right across Defra. So previously the process was the budgets would be allocated, so X% plus or minus on what last year's was, and then go away and decide what you're doing. What we're now having is a process that says, what are the activities we want to achieve as a whole? What will they cost? So it's much more of a bottom-up budgeting process.
Just one final one before handing over to Daniel to open it up. Is you mentioned local a few times, and of course the environment, as you rightly say, is local. How much are you being affected by what's happening on the decentralisation agenda of the Treasury and Greg Clark? I mean, the combined authorities and so on. How much is that going to affect your work?
There are some cases where that could be part of the devolution deal. So particularly areas like flood defences are certainly being looked at as part of particular deals. But more broadly, the agenda we're putting forward, which is all about people at a local level having much better tools to understand their local environment, people in our organisation being empowered to make decisions at a local level, fits very much with the devolution agenda.
Daniel, thank you.
Thank you. Now is the moment when you get the chance to ask questions. Please wait for the microphone to arrive. Please say who you are, and if you work for an organisation, please say what that is. And if you're in the room next door, in the spillover room, please do come through and ask questions if you so desire. So, has Peter already asked all of the questions that you had in mind? I see Peter Unwin has his hand up.
Thank you, Daniel. Peter Unwin, once of Defra, but now at the Whitehall and Industry Group, which, for those who don't know it, is an independent charity that promotes learning and better understanding between the civil service industry and the third sector. Liz, you've worked in big corporations in the private sector, and now you're running a big government department. You've touched on this a bit already, but what are the big lessons for Whitehall from industry, and what are the big lessons in the other direction?
Thank you for that question, Peter. What I have found out, and I've worked for both big organisations and small organisations, and actually big organisations have a lot in common with other big organisations, regardless of whether they're in the public or private sector. And certainly when I joined Shell, they had a similar grading structure to the civil service, which they gradually dispensed with, but there was bits of the culture remind me of the culture that you see today in Whitehall. The grade thing I find very interesting. I remember going to one of the first meetings as a junior minister at the Department of Education, and this is one of the cabinet committees, and people sit round and they have name badges in front of them, and one name just said grade 7, Department of the Environment or something, and people being known by their grades is, I think, something about Whitehall that
And the military.
Quite possibly, and I think we are moving into an era where we need people with particular skills and talents, and the idea that just a generic person with a generic grade can fit the bill is perhaps something Whitehall could learn from the private sector, is how do we actually encourage those specific talents to rise within an organisation. But I also don't think that Whitehall should beat itself up about there's a great, fantastic, efficient world out there. All organisations have their idiosyncrasies. I think that being open about that and being prepared to share ideas is really important. And one of the things that by having a clearer governance structure for Defra Group, I want to be able to open up to more of those organisations to be able to work more easily with government and be more open to that.
Thank you. I've got one here, and then next here, and over here. Yep.
Hi, Emily Gosden from The Telegraph. Secretary of State, you mentioned in your speech about being looking at making national parks, Kew and the Forestry Commission land attract more visitors and making sure that these huge public assets should benefit the public as a whole. Could you expand some more on, in particular, what you're looking at in those areas? So in what ways they could benefit people that they're perhaps not at the moment? And in particular, in respect of Kew and forest land, is there a case of perhaps cutting ticket prices or cutting car park charges to help attract more people? Thanks.
Thank
So-
you. Sorry, go ahead.
Do you want to take 3 questions?
Well, perhaps, yes. Perhaps,
Okay, sorry.
as we're short of time, perhaps...
Okay, it's a slightly different question, so you might want to answer that one first. Or
Okay.
I'll go ahead if you like.
All right, go ahead. Yep.
I'll go ahead. So the national parks, I think, are a massive asset, and one of the things we've done in Defra's budget is protect their funding in real terms because we think they're so important. We're working with the national parks on a programme about how we could encourage more visitors, but also how do we get school children into national parks who maybe haven't traditionally visited, don't come from the areas near those national parks. How can they get that experience? Kew is shortly about to open a new children's centre as well, and we're looking at that. And also Defra is responsible for a lot of Forestry Commission land, and again, I'm interested in how we open that up more widely. But I'm not just talking about visitors, it's also working in the national parks. So something few people know about the national parks is 10% of all their employees are apprentices. I think that's a fantastic record, but it gives a big opportunity for a bigger countryside apprenticeship programme. So that's something I'm also looking at.
Sir?
Thank you. I'm Roland Jackson, the Executive Chair of ScienceWise, which is a programme of BIS that encourages government departments and supports government departments, commission public dialogue around issues involving science and technology in particular. I was interested in your announcement, Secretary of State, that you were going to use the dialogue platform when you published your 25-year environment plan. And interested in your views on the extent to which deliberative public dialogue is useful at earlier stages of policy development. In other words, as policy is being formed, alongside openness to other expertise which you talked about, rather than, as would appear to be the case in this case, the implementation of that plan. In other words, further upstream in policy development.
I think the more upstream, the better. And I think getting views in earlier rather than later is a good thing. So, and this, I mean, when I'm talking about a 25-year plan, 25-year framework which is launching in spring, clearly by Christmas we want to have a plan in place, but that plan will develop over time. What we're talking about is getting the structures right so that people and communities can make good environmental decisions. So I think there's a question of not just how do we make sure people are engaged in putting the plan together, but how do we maintain that over the long term? Because one of the concerns I have about being a policymaker in government is sometimes it can be a small group of expert people, and that's good. We need those people. We need people who've really thought about it. But there's a bigger question to me about how do we widen that debate and how do we make people feel more engaged in government as well as more engaged in politics. And I think at the moment sometimes it can be quite hard if you don't know how to do that.
Certainly here at the Institute we try to do that. Sir?
Thank you. Rafe Smith, Campaign to Protect Rural England. Secretary of State, does Defra have a role in opening up data at the local level in rural areas? We've seen London and Manchester, for example, have world-leading data stores. Is there a role for Defra to help that happen in rural areas, whether at a county level or perhaps being mindful of resource constraints at a sub-national level?
So we have a lot of local data ourselves, which has been released, and as I've said, a third of all government data available is Defra data. one of the things we are looking at is doing some road shows around the country to see what other data other organisations have, because I've mentioned the massive number of organisations involved in the environment, organisations like the CPRE, wildlife organisations. I think linking that data together has huge potential, and that applies to local county data as well.
Thank you. So I have that gentleman in the row there, and then the gentleman in front here. Yeah.
Thank you. Matthew Spencer, Green Alliance. Secretary of State, I wondered if I could tempt you to talk at all about the implications of the European referendum for the working of your department, given that there are over 100 environmental agreements which govern the environment in Britain, which are derived from Europe. Can you foresee your modernisation project continuing as it is if we were to leave the European Union?
Should I answer that one? Or
It's up
take
to you,
it?
Secretary of State.
I think you were one of the authors of a letter in the paper, which no doubt everybody in the audience can read. We're still in the middle of a renegotiation. We don't know what the terms will be. I think the Prime Minister's making good progress, but I am yet to see the results of that. So I think it would be very premature to comment at this stage.
This gentleman here.
Carl Allen, I'm a pensioner, but I also mentor students. Two things. One, what's the position of Defra on climate change in regard to its 25-year plan?
Mm-hmm.
And two, it's expensive to go into the countryside. On occasion, I want to take those students that I mentor into the countryside, but the cost of transport is prohibitive. So unless that is dealt with in some deliberate way, I don't see much of the countryside opening up to students.
Okay. In terms of your second point about the countryside, I agree. There are cost constraints, and one of the things I do want to make sure is that everybody in our country has access to our fantastic natural assets. So it's something I will look at as part of the plans. What was the first part of your question?
Climate change.
Climate change. So climate change, my department's responsible for climate change adaptation, and that is factored into all the planning work we do. But clearly, there are parts of our department that also contribute to carbon generation, or indeed carbon reduction, and that will also be part of our 25-year framework, looking at the impact, for example, forestry has on carbon.
Okay, let's take another group. So I've got two here.
Charles Eels from Microsoft. You've been very passionate about data and releasing data sets, but for someone who's looked at open.data.gov, there's a lot of data sets on that don't actually get used at all. So I suppose the question is, great having 8,000 data sets that are going to be released, but what's the plan in terms of making sure that they are used and making sure the data is accurate, updated, etc. So I don't know if you could just talk a bit more about your vision in terms of what you would like to see the outcomes of that and how Defra plays a role.
And let's take the gentleman in front as well. Just pass the microphone forward. Thank you. Yep.
Thanks very much. John, I'm wondering what's likely to be the impact of this modernising process upon the relationship between the department and outside groups. I mean, the National Farmers Union might be too obvious example. Perhaps take another one, the one I volunteer for, the Wildfire and Wetlands Trust. Thank you.
Can you please pass the microphone forward? Yeah.
Thanks. Greg Rosen, Consultant Director at Reform. You mentioned the grading system at Defra and Civil Service and how you were struck by that and how it reminded you of the rigidity of some of the traditional grading systems back at Shell back in the day. Just wondering, in terms of the reflections that you've made on the department and the modernisation work you're doing, how you see the issue of churn, which has often been raised by many senior civil servants as a cause of concern, in terms of the expertise within the department being moved around, people being moved around as soon as they work out what they're doing in a particular role, and the role of that rigidity of the grading system in forcing that churn, encouraging that churn, because without moving around, people can't get necessarily promoted in post, and the rigidity of the grading system precluding that.
Thank you.
So just on the first point about data and whether it's used, first of all, it's an iterative process, so we're using it to see which data isn't used, and do we need to collect that data if there is no use for it at all. And that could help reduce costs in our organisation, but reduce the bureaucratic burden we place on others. But where there is data being produced by different organisations that we could use, we should also look at that. But I think what you're asking about is also the next stage up. So how do you change that data into useful information? And our data team are holding various workshops on that, making sure that that data is useful, and that is very much the phase. The reason, though, we've had a push on quantity is we wanted to get the message right across Defra and the wider world that this was a priority, and that opening up the assets we had was important. And environmental data and geospatial data are the two sorts of data most in demand from companies. Those are huge assets that government is sitting on. So I was determined we were going to use them. But the next phase is very much making sure we've got the quality, and also making sure that it's being properly used and we're not collecting data for the sake of it. It is data that people actually need. In terms of our relationships with the outside world, I want us to become, I think we are a pretty open department, but I want us to be even more open and be able to interact with groups, but both at a national level and a local level, and be able to get things done. And this work we're doing around catchment management does make it much more easy to integrate with local groups like the Wetlands Trust and so on, who do a fantastic job in my constituency at the Welney site there. In terms of the grading system, I mean, every organisation needs a structure, and I'm not necessarily saying that it's not a matter for me anyway, it's a matter for the civil service about how they grade people. I think the point I was making is about it shouldn't be the all-defining characteristic of somebody is that they're a particular grade. It's about the skills that they bring to the job. And I think there's always a trade-off between people getting a wide range of experience, and ministers are well known for moving around government departments and not. I think one of the Prime Minister's great achievements is keeping ministers in job long enough so that they are able to learn. But I have also found, as a minister, moving from education to environment has been very beneficial, and I'm able to take learnings I've seen at education and apply them in environment, and vice versa. And so there's always a trade-off in these things, between getting somebody with the right expertise, but also giving people a chance to grow. And one of the points I was making earlier about the organisation is I want to see our highly expert staff who work at a local level really empowered to make decisions. They know what the right thing is to do. I mean, when I was up in Yorkshire last week talking to staffing who've been working on Calder Valley and the flood defences in Mythenroyd, they know exactly what should be done. And our structure needs to empower people rather than people feeling that they're not necessarily able to get those points of view across.
Peter?
Yeah, just before we finish, one interesting thing you touched on. We've done a lot of work here with ministers, and we did the induction for new ministers after the election and so on. And it touched on a lot of what you've said about the experience people bring to a job. And you mentioned at the beginning that you work for two big private sector organisations. How much difference has that made as you at the top of a department? I mean, not the minister at the top, that's Claire Moriarty's job as permanent secretary, but your job as political head of the department. How much difference it made working in large organisations? Because most of your opposite numbers have worked in pretty small organisations. They've either been those who are barristers or whatever, or political advisors or whatever, quite small scale stuff. What difference does that make, do you think? Because I think it's very interesting when one talks to ministers and ex-ministers about their experience and what made them effective and trying to define effectiveness.
I think what it does give me is an understanding of how big organisations work and, you know, frankly, the small p politics that exist in big organisations. And there are huge advantages to working in big organisations, which is that there are a lot of stuff you don't have to worry about. So if you're working for a small company, you worry about making sure bills get paid and things, whereas jobs tend to be more closely defined in bigger organisations. I think it also has given me an interest in understanding how organisations work, which I'm very interested in and discuss regularly with the permanent secretary, because we are at the start of a reform programme, which is why I'm keen to be here today talking about it. And in my view, the reform programme is only going to work because Claire is behind it, I am behind it, the chief executives of our ALBs are behind it, the boards of the ALBs are behind it, we've got the board of Defra behind it, and we're all pushing in the same direction, and that's how we get things done. Because I think having worked in a big company, I don't underestimate how hard it is to turn around the proverbial oil tanker and to make, not a Shell specific analogy, although frequently used in that business, but it does take everybody pulling in the same direction, and it's probably a slightly different thing from, it's inherently less nimble. But I think what I'm saying is I think we can leverage in nimble thinkers into that organisation.
How long will it take to, I mean, we'll have to be careful with oil tanker analogies at present, most of them will be empty, but I mean, how long will it take to achieve those changes and reform?
Well, in sort of modern business parlance, change is the constant. I don't think you ever finish reforming an organisation, because time changes, we need to adapt to the conditions we find ourselves in. And things like getting to a single plan for all of our organisations will take a number of years. The long-term environment plan, restoring the health of some of our habitats, it will take longer than that. In the recent flooding that we've seen in the north of England, a lot of people have been saying, can't we do better upland management? Yes, that is very important, but if we want to put more forested areas to reduce the flow upstream, that's not, planting a tree is not something that comes to fruition in a few years. These are inevitably very long-term issues that we're dealing with.
Last question from the gentleman at the back there.
Richard Wakeford. I work internationally on rural development, but I have significant experience in Defra. I was on the management board as a non-executive director for a time. And I pick up some of the things that you've been talking about, Secretary of State, in terms of making the best of the things that the national parks can offer. And it's a great agenda, and I congratulate you on it. But also, as a board member on the Cotswolds AONB, can I just do a little bit of special pleading? Don't forget that there are other protected areas which have the same potential, and to meet the point of the colleague across the corridor there, they're often more accessible than some of the national parks, which tend to be in the kind of higher and more remote bits. So make sure that the AONBs are on your agenda as well.
I absolutely will do, and they are absolutely part of the plan as well. So.
Thank you for that. So visit the countryside, visit the Cotswolds, visit areas of special scientific interest. Secretary of State, thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. Please come back and tell us how your reform programme is progressing, and please join me in thanking Liz Truss.